In 1822, Colonel Richard Ashford purchased an enslaved man named George for $1,850, 7 feet 2 inches tall, valued as prime breeding stock for his plantation. Ashford didn't anticipate George turning that breeding program into calculated revenge. By February 1823, all 3 Ashford daughters were pregnant with George's children, destroying South Carolina's most prominent planter family. When Ashford discovered the truth, he confronted George with armed overseers. By dawn, 4 white men lay dead, and George had vanished. Before we continue with this story of revenge, hit subscribe. Drop your state in the comments. I want to know how far this reaches. The Boy Who Grew Too Large to Ignore, Charleston, South Carolina, in the spring of 1800 existed as a city of extremes, where extraordinary wealth built on human bondage created both architectural magnificence and moral rot that poisoned everything it touched. The air smelled of salt marsh and human misery, of jasmine blooming in gardens maintained by enslaved hands, and the sweat of thousands of people whose labor built mansions they would never enter except as servants. Among the hundreds of enslaved children born that year on plantations surrounding the city was a boy whose mother named him George, a simple English name that would become legendary for reasons she could never have anticipated. His mother, whose name appeared in plantation ledgers only as Sarah, field hand, age approximately 22, had given birth alone in a cabin she shared with 7 other women, attended only by an elderly enslaved woman who served as midwife for births the white doctor considered beneath his professional attention. The child that emerged that spring night was unremarkable initially, crying with the same desperate hunger as any newborn, small enough to cradle in Sarah's arms with the tenderness that slavery tried, but failed to extinguish completely. But George grew in ways that defied normal patterns of human development. By age 3, he stood as tall as children twice his age. By 6, he required clothing meant for adolescence, his limbs elongating with such speed that Sarah could not keep pace with his needs using the meager cloth rations provided quarterly. By 8, George stood taller than most adult men on the plantation, his hands large enough to palm a man's skull, his shoulders broadening with muscle that suggested strength beyond what his years should contain. The overseer, a man named Thomas Whitmore, who had managed enslaved workers for 2 decades, watched George's growth with increasing unease. Whitmore understood intuitively what the plantation owner, consumed with cotton prices and political ambitions, failed to grasp. Physical power that could not be controlled through ordinary violence represented danger to the entire system of subjugation that kept 200 enslaved people compliant on the Rutledge plantation. A grown man could be whipped into submission, could be broken psychologically through calculated cruelty, could be managed through the constant threat of family separation or sale. But a boy growing into a giant, possessing strength that might render whips ineffective and intimidation meaningless, challenged the fundamental assumption that physical dominance belonged exclusively to white overseers and owners. By age 12, George measured 6 feet 4 inches and possessed the musculature of a man in his prime. He worked the fields alongside adults, his productivity extraordinary because his size allowed him to accomplish in hours what took others days. He could lift cotton bales that required 3 men to move, could work from dawn to dusk without the visible exhaustion that bent other workers, could endure the Carolina heat that killed men half his size during brutal summer months. But George's most dangerous attribute was not his size or strength. It was his intelligence, carefully hidden behind the mask of docility that enslaved people wore for survival. He watched, he listened, he learned. He understood that his value to the plantation lay in his extraordinary physicality, but he also understood that value made him vulnerable in different ways, that owners would seek to exploit not just his labor but his capacity to produce offspring who might inherit his advantageous traits. By 16, When George measured 6 feet 10 inches and possessed strength that made experienced field bosses nervous, he had already begun calculating how to survive in a system designed to consume people like him completely. The auction that changed everything. The slave market on Chalmers Street in Charleston operated with the casual brutality of commerce that treated human beings as livestock. Families separated on auction blocks while buyers examined teeth and muscles with the detachment of men evaluating horses or cattle. The market opened at dawn 6 days weekly except Sunday, when even slave traders observed the Sabbath with church attendance that apparently presented no moral contradiction to their profession. On a humid August morning in 1822, the market was particularly crowded, buyers converging from across South Carolina and Georgia for an estate sale that would liquidate the Rutledge Plantation's entire enslaved population. George stood on the auction block for the first time that morning, his wrists and ankles shackled with iron restraints specially forged to accommodate his extraordinary size, his expression carefully neutral. Despite the terror and rage that churned beneath the surface, he showed the world. At 22 years old, he had spent his entire life on a single plantation, had known his mother until she died from complications of childbirth when he was 14, had formed relationships with other enslaved people that provided the only family he would know. Now those connections were being severed with the mechanical efficiency of economic necessity. People he had known since childhood sold individually to buyers from distant states, separated forever by transactions that took minutes to complete. The auctioneer, recognizing that George represented the estate's most valuable property, saved him for last, building anticipation through the morning as lesser slaves were sold, for amounts ranging from $400 to $900 depending on age, health, and skills. When George finally stepped onto the auction block just after noon, the crowd's energy shifted perceptibly. Men pressed forward for better views, conversations quieted, and the auctioneer launched into a presentation designed to maximize the bidding that would determine George's price and future. The auctioneer detailed George's attributes with the enthusiasm of a man selling exceptional livestock. 7 feet 2 inches in height, approximately 280 pounds of solid muscle. No visible defects or injuries despite 22 years of field labor, capable of performing work equivalent to 3 ordinary men, and most significantly, literate and capable of basic mathematics, skills that made him valuable for plantation management as well as physical labor. The auctioneer emphasized George's breeding potential with language that made several women in the crowd uncomfortable enough to leave, describing him as prime stock whose offspring would likely inherit his extraordinary physical advantages, creating value that would compound across generations. The bidding began at $1,000, already higher than most enslaved people would sell for in their entire lifetimes. Within minutes, it escalated to $1,400 as 3 serious buyers competed for ownership. The bidders represented different calculations about George's value. One was a rice plantation owner from the low country who needed workers capable of enduring brutal conditions in malarial swamps. Another was a cotton planter from the Piedmont who operated breeding programs designed to improve his enslaved population's productivity. And the third was Colonel Richard Ashford, whose interest in George combined both labor potential and genetic ambitions that would prove catastrophic for everyone involved. When the bidding reached $1,850, the rice planter and the breeder both withdrew, leaving Ashford as the winning buyer. The price represented nearly double what most enslaved men would command at auction, a sum that reflected both George's extraordinary physicality and the planter class's increasing interest in selective breeding programs that applied livestock management principles to human reproduction. George, watching this transaction that would determine his fate, maintained the expressionless mask he had perfected over 22 years, revealing nothing of the calculations already forming about how he might survive whatever hell awaited him at Ashford's plantation. The plantation owner who bought a monster, 581 words. Colonel Richard Ashford owned 2,400 acres of prime cotton land in the Piedmont region of South Carolina, worked by 147 enslaved people whose labor had made him one of the state's wealthiest men by 1822. His plantation, called Ashford Hall, featured a main house of imposing Greek Revival architecture, white columns rising 3 stories to support a roof that could be seen for miles across fields that produced cotton yields envied by competitors. The house contained 18 rooms filled with furniture imported from Europe, a library of over 400 volumes, and a wine cellar stocked with vintages that cost more than most enslaved people's purchase price. Ashford himself was 52 years old in August 1822, a man whose life had been defined by accumulation and control. He had inherited the plantation from his father at age 25, already substantial but modest compared to what it would become under his management. Through 3 decades of obsessive attention to agricultural innovation, market timing, and what he called scientific approaches to labor management, Ashford had transformed a profitable operation into an empire that generated annual revenues exceeding $30,000, an extraordinary sum that placed him among South Carolina's planter aristocracy. He was twice widowed, his first wife dying in childbirth at age 19, his second succumbing to typhoid fever after 10 years of marriage that produced 3 daughters, but no male heir to inherit the empire he had built. The absence of sons troubled Ashford deeply, not from sentiment but from practical concern about succession and legacy. His daughters, while beloved in the abstract way that busy men love their children, represented incomplete solutions to the problem of dynastic continuity. They would marry eventually, their wealth transferred to husbands who would absorb the Ashford fortune into their own family lines, the Ashford name itself fading from prominence within a generation. This preoccupation with legacy and genetic continuity had led Ashford to develop what he considered progressive approaches to managing his enslaved population. Rather than simply working people until they died and replacing them through purchase, Ashford had begun implementing breeding programs designed to improve the quality of enslaved workers across generations. He maintained detailed records documenting which women produced the strongest children, which men showed desirable physical characteristics, which pairings created offspring with attributes he valued: size, strength, endurance, intelligence sufficient for complex tasks, but not so much as to make them dangerous. When Ashford saw George at the Charleston auction, he recognized immediately what George represented: the culmination of breeding strategies that most planters only theorized about. George was living proof that selective breeding could produce humans with extraordinary attributes, that the same techniques that improved livestock could be applied to enslaved populations, with results that might revolutionize plantation economics. If George's size and strength were heritable traits, if they could be propagated across Ashford's enslaved population through carefully managed reproduction, the resulting productivity increases would generate wealth beyond what conventional agricultural methods could achieve. Ashford paid one at $850 without hesitation, a price that made other buyers question his judgment, but which Ashford calculated as bargain investment in genetic capital that would appreciate exponentially over decades. He planned to use George primarily as breeding stock, pairing him with the strongest and healthiest enslaved women on the plantation, creating offspring who might inherit George's advantages and transform Ashford Hall's labor force into something unprecedented in Southern agriculture. But Ashford made a fundamental error in his calculations, one that would prove fatal. He assumed that extraordinary physical power could be controlled through the same methods that controlled ordinary men, that George could be managed, directed, and exploited without consequence. He failed to consider that intelligence combined with strength might produce something no amount of whips and chains could contain: the daughters who lived in gilded cages. The Ashford daughters occupied a peculiar position in antebellum South Carolina society, possessing privilege that was simultaneously absolute and completely illusory. They lived in material comfort that most people could never imagine, slept in beds with imported linens, wore dresses that cost more than enslaved families earned in lifetimes they would never control, ate meals prepared by cooks whose names they barely knew. Yet their lives were as constrained as any enslaved person's, their futures determined by fathers and husbands, their autonomy limited to choices so trivial they hardly qualified as decisions at all. Margaret, the eldest at 23 in the summer of 1822, embodied the contradictions of her position with particular clarity. She was beautiful by the standards of her era, fair-skinned and delicate-featured, accomplished in all the feminine arts that antebellum society valued. She played piano competently, sang with a pleasant if unremarkable voice, painted watercolors of flowers and landscapes, and could conduct conversations in French with the stilted formality of someone who had learned the language from books rather than native speakers. She had been engaged twice to suitable men who died before the weddings could occur, first from yellow fever that swept through Charleston in 1818, second from a riding accident in 1820 that broke his neck when his horse spooked at a snake crossing the path. These deaths had given Margaret a reputation for being unlucky or possibly cursed, superstitious whispers that damaged her matrimonial prospects, despite her beauty and substantial dowry. By 23, she was approaching the age when unmarried women became objects of pity rather than desire, their value declining with each year that passed without producing the children that justified their existence in a society that had no place for women who did not marry. Carolyn, at 21, had rejected 4 proposals in 3 years, each time finding something objectionable about men her father considered perfect matches. One was too old, another too obviously interested only in her dowry. A third had a reputation for violence toward servants that suggested he would be equally violent toward a wife. And the fourth simply repulsed her in ways she could not articulate without seeming hysterical. Her repeated rejections had made Colonel Ashford increasingly impatient with what he called her romantic fastidiousness, as if expecting mutual affection, or basic compatibility in marriage, was unreasonable indulgence rather than minimal human dignity. Carolyn possessed an intelligence that made her unsuited for the life she was expected to lead. She read voraciously everything she could access in her father's library, from agricultural treatises to philosophical works that questioned the very social order she inhabited. She asked questions that made her family uncomfortable, wondering aloud why enslaved people were considered property when they clearly possessed the same capacity for thought and feeling as white people, questioning whether the Bible's teachings about human dignity could be reconciled with institutions built on denying that dignity to anyone with African ancestry. Elizabeth, the youngest at 19, had never been courted seriously, her shyness and preference for books over social gatherings making her unmarketable in a society that valued beauty and obedience over intelligence. She spent her days reading in the Plantation library, a room her father rarely entered, losing herself in novels that transported her to worlds where women had adventures and made choices and lived lives that extended beyond marriage and childbirth. She was the quietest of the 3 sisters, often overlooked in family gatherings, dismissed as the plain one despite possessing a subtle beauty that more observant men might have appreciated. These 3 women, trapped by wealth and gender in lives of enforced uselessness, represented everything that was both privileged and pathetic about Southern aristocratic femininity. They would never know hunger or homelessness, would never perform physical labor or experience the brutal indignities that enslaved women endured daily. But neither would they know freedom, autonomy, or the simple dignity of making meaningful choices about their own existence. The breeding program that violated every human principle, so if I to 8 words. Colonel Ashford's plantation operated according to principles drawn from livestock management, applying to human beings the same selective breeding techniques he used to improve his cattle and horses. The program had begun modestly in 1810, when Ashford first read agricultural journals from Virginia, describing experiments in human breeding that claimed to increase enslaved workers' productivity through careful attention to hereditary traits. What started as theoretical interest evolved over a decade into systematic practice that treated human reproduction as agricultural science, requiring the same methodical attention as crop rotation or soil management. Ashford maintained detailed records in ledgers he kept locked in his study, documents that would have scandalized even other slaveholders if made public, not because they found the practices morally objectionable, but because the explicit documentation of breeding programs made uncomfortable realities impossible to ignore through willful blindness. The ledgers recorded which enslaved women had produced children, noting each child's physical characteristics, health, and apparent intelligence. They documented which men showed desirable attributes: size, strength, endurance, docility, resistance to common diseases that killed workers and reduced productivity. Based on these records, Ashford's overseer would arrange pairings designed to propagate advantageous traits while eliminating undesirable ones. Enslaved women considered prime breeding stock would be matched with men selected for their physical characteristics, told explicitly that they were expected to produce children, and that failure to do so would result in punishment, ranging from reduced rations to sale away from the plantation. The program was conducted with mechanical efficiency that denied every human emotion that might complicate reproductive transactions Ashford considered purely economic calculations. Pregnancies were monitored and documented. Enslaved women required to report their conditions immediately so that work assignments could be adjusted, and miscarriages investigated for causes that might be addressed in future pregnancies. Women who produced healthy children received marginally better treatment, extra food rations during pregnancy, and brief respite from fieldwork after birth. Incentives designed to encourage reproduction. Women who failed to conceive after repeated pairings were noted in ledgers as potentially infertile and subsequently subjected to particularly brutal work assignments, their value diminished by reproductive failure. Children born into this system were evaluated at birth and periodically thereafter, their physical development tracked to determine whether they exhibited the traits their parentage was designed to produce. Children showing exceptional size or strength were noted as potential breeding stock themselves, their futures predetermined by genetic advantages that made them valuable to the plantation's long-term productivity. Children born with defects or showing signs of illness were sometimes denied medical care that might have saved them, economic calculation determining that resources invested in weak children produced poor returns compared to resources directed toward healthy specimens. The entire program operated on assumptions about heredity that mixed legitimate observation with speculation and outright myth. Ashford believed that traits like strength and endurance were straightforwardly heritable, which was partially accurate, but he also believed that psychological characteristics like docility and intelligence could be bred for or against through selective pairing, which reflected antebellum pseudoscience more than genuine understanding of human genetics. He convinced himself that he was conducting agricultural improvement, applying rational methods to increase productivity, never allowing himself to confront the fundamental truth that treating human beings as breeding stock was irredeemably evil, regardless of whether it produced desired economic outcomes. George represented the pinnacle of Ashford's breeding ambitions, a man whose extraordinary physicality suggested genetic advantages that could be propagated across the plantation's enslaved population if properly managed. Ashford planned to pair George with multiple women, creating offspring whose inherited size and strength would increase plantation productivity for generations. The fact that George himself might have opinions about being used as breeding stock apparently never occurred to Ashford, who had spent so many years treating enslaved people as property that he had lost any capacity to recognize them as human beings, with interior lives that might resist the uses to which they were subjected. The first encounter that planted dangerous seeds. 589 words. Margaret Ashford encountered George for the first time in late September 1822, 3 weeks after her father purchased him at the Charleston market. She had been riding alone through the plantation's eastern fields, violating her father's standing instruction that daughters should never venture unaccompanied into areas where field workers labored, when her horse threw a shoe and went lame half a mile from the main house. The horse, a high-strung mare that Margaret had received for her 20th birthday, refused to continue with the damaged hoof, pulling against the reins and tossing her head with distress that suggested pain beyond what Margaret could address without assistance. Margaret dismounted to examine the injury, her riding dress immediately collecting dust and burrs from vegetation that lined the dirt path between cotton fields. She had limited experience with actual horse care, her knowledge theoretical rather than practical, because enslaved grooms handled such matters at Ashford Hall, leaving her capable of riding but incompetent at addressing problems when they arose. She was attempting to lift the mare's injured hoof when she heard footsteps approaching and looked up to see George emerging from the cotton field, where he had been working on irrigation ditches that would channel water during the summer months when rainfall proved inadequate. Margaret's first reaction was fear, trained into her through years of warnings about the dangers of being alone with enslaved men, stories of violence and violation that white women used to justify the brutal control mechanisms that kept enslaved people terrorized. George stood 7 feet 2 inches tall, his frame massive in ways that made him appear almost inhuman, his skin dark and gleaming with sweat from hours of physical labor under the September sun. He could kill her easily, could do anything he wanted to her, and no one would intervene in time to prevent whatever he chose to do. But George stopped at a respectful distance, his posture non-threatening, his eyes averted in the way enslaved people learned to avoid appearing insolent. "Miss Margaret," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man his size. "Your horse appears injured. May I assist you?" The deference was calculated, the subservience performed, but something in his tone suggested intelligence that contradicted the servile role he played for survival. Margaret, uncertain whether to send him away or accept help she genuinely needed, finally nodded. "The shoe came loose. I cannot walk her back to the stable in this condition." Her voice sounded imperious even to her own ears, the tone of mistress addressing property, but George seemed unbothered by her manner as he approached the mare and began examining the injured hoof with competence that suggested genuine knowledge of animal care. The mare, skittish with Margaret, calmed immediately under George's touch. He ran his hands down her leg with professional efficiency, speaking to the animal in low tones that soothed her anxiety, then carefully lifted the hoof to assess the damage. "The shoe is completely gone, Miss Margaret. The nail pulled through, which sometimes happens when horses step wrong on uneven ground. She should not be ridden until a farrier replaces it, but I can lead her back to the stable slowly if you wish to walk beside us." What should have been a brief, formal interaction became something more complicated, as Margaret found herself walking beside George through fields worked by enslaved people who watched with expressions she could not read. George said nothing beyond what courtesy demanded, but Margaret found herself acutely aware of him in ways she had never experienced with enslaved workers who existed for her as invisible background labor rather than actual people. His intelligence was immediately apparent in how he assessed the horse's condition, his gentleness surprising as he calmed the animal and guided her through terrain that required careful navigation. His voice when he occasionally spoke to Margaret, carrying none of the exaggerated subservience she expected, but rather a quiet confidence that suggested he saw her as clearly as she was beginning to see him. The overseer who understood what others missed. 584 words. Samuel Crawford had managed Ashford's plantation for 8 years, maintaining the brutal efficiency that produced profits, while keeping enslaved workers frightened enough to remain compliant. He was 41 years old in 1822, a lean man with sun-damaged skin and eyes that never stopped calculating, watching, assessing threats to the order he was paid to maintain. Crawford had grown up poor white in South Carolina, son of a failed farmer who drank away what little money the family possessed, and he had clawed his way into plantation management through competence and ruthlessness that made enslaved workers fear him more than they feared the colonel himself. Crawford understood better than most overseers that control depended not just on violence, but on psychological dominance, on creating systems where resistance seemed futile and submission became habitual. He knew when to use the whip and when to use deprivation, when to separate families, and when to allow relationships that gave enslaved people something to lose if they misbehaved. He could read enslaved workers the way hunters read prey, identifying which individuals might become problems before they acted on whatever resentments festered beneath the masks of docility that survival demanded. But George troubled Crawford in ways he could not quite articulate to Colonel Ashford, who dismissed his concerns as paranoia unbecoming of someone paid to maintain order. Crawford had noticed things others missed about George during his first weeks at Ashford Hall, how enslaved workers deferred to George despite his recent arrival and lack of established social position within the plantation's complex hierarchy. How George's presence in the fields changed the atmosphere in ways Crawford could sense but not prove. A subtle shift in how workers carried themselves. A reduction in the visible fear that normally characterized their interactions with white overseers. Most troubling was how George watched the white overseers and the colonel himself, with an expression Crawford recognized from his years managing enslaved populations. It was not fear, which was appropriate and expected, nor was it the blank passivity that most enslaved people adopted as protective camouflage. It was calculation, assessment, the look of someone studying systems to identify weaknesses that might be exploited. Crawford had seen that expression before in enslaved workers who later attempted escape or committed violence against overseers or owners, and it invariably preceded trouble that cost plantations money and sometimes lives. Crawford tried explaining his concerns to Colonel Ashford in late September, choosing his words carefully because he understood that Ashford's substantial investment in George made the colonel resistant to suggestions that his expensive purchase might represent danger rather than asset. "Sir, I believe we should be cautious with the new acquisition. His size makes him difficult to control through conventional discipline, and I have observed behaviors that suggest he may be less docile than his demeanor indicates." But Ashford waved away the warnings with the confidence of a man who had never personally experienced violence from enslaved workers, and therefore could not imagine it occurring to him. "Crawford, you worry excessively. George is valuable property that cost nearly $2,000 to acquire. I expect you to manage him appropriately, but I will not have him damaged through excessive discipline based on your instincts. He will be paired with selected breeding partners beginning next month, and I require him healthy and undamaged for that purpose." The conversation ended with Crawford dismissed but not reassured, his concerns noted but not addressed, his warnings filed away as the excessive caution of a man paid to prevent problems rather than the legitimate threat assessment of someone who understood that systems of violent control eventually produced violent resistance. Crawford returned to his duties, watching George with increased vigilance, knowing that something would eventually break but unable to predict when or how catastrophe would arrive at Ashford Hall. The night Caroline's world changed forever. 595 words. On October 17, 1822, Caroline Ashford made a decision that would shatter the careful architecture of her sheltered life and set in motion events neither she nor anyone else at Ashford Plantation could have predicted. She had been reading in the plantation library well past the hour when respectable women should have retired, absorbed in a novel that transported her away from the suffocating expectations of her daily routine, when she heard sounds from the direction of the slave quarters that made her stomach clench with familiar dread. Screaming, the kind that suggested someone was being whipped, the brutal soundtrack of plantation discipline that Caroline had spent 21 years training herself to ignore. She tried returning to her book, tried focusing on fictional characters whose problems seemed manageable compared to the real suffering, occurring a quarter mile from where she sat in comfortable lamplight. But something that night, perhaps the desperate quality of the screaming, perhaps the fact that it continued far longer than usual discipline sessions, perhaps her own growing dissatisfaction with moral cowardice masquerading as propriety, compelled her to close her book and move toward the window overlooking the quarters. What she saw from that window violated every assumption she had maintained about the supposed humanity of plantation operations. Crawford stood in the central area between slave cabins, illuminated by torchlight, directing two assistant overseers who were administering a whipping to an enslaved man tied to the punishment post. The victim's back was already shredded, blood running down his legs to pool in the dust beneath him, but Crawford showed no indication that punishment was nearing its end. Other enslaved workers had been forced to watch, standing in a semicircle around the scene, required to witness what happened to anyone who violated plantation rules. Caroline turned from the window, sickened by what she had seen but uncertain what action she could possibly take. She had no authority to intervene in discipline matters, no standing to question Crawford's methods, no power to do anything except retreat to her comfortable bedroom and try forgetting what she had witnessed. But as she moved through the darkened house toward the stairs that led to her second-floor room, she found herself deviating from the intended path, moving instead toward the back door that led to the plantation yard and the quarters beyond. What she intended when she left the house, Caroline could never afterward explain satisfactorily, even to herself. Perhaps she thought she could appeal to Crawford's sense of proportion, could convince him that sufficient punishment had been administered. Perhaps she simply needed to bear witness, to refuse the complicity that came from comfortable ignorance. Perhaps she was driven by impulses she did not fully understand, currents of rebellion against the entire system that her life depended upon, but which she was beginning to recognize as fundamentally evil. She reached the quarters just as the whipping ended, the victim unconscious and bleeding, Crawford directing that he be cut down and left to recover or die according to his constitution. The enslaved workers were dispersing to their cabins when Caroline appeared at the edge of the circle, her white dress gleaming in torchlight, her presence so unexpected that even Crawford was momentarily speechless. "Miss Caroline," Crawford finally said, recovering his composure with visible effort, "you should not be here. These matters are not appropriate for—" "What did he do?" Caroline interrupted, her voice steadier than she felt. "What offense warranted this level of punishment?" Crawford's expression hardened. "He was caught teaching other slaves to read, Miss Caroline. Your father's rules about literacy are explicit, and this man knowingly violated them." Caroline looked past Crawford to the unconscious man still tied to the post, and recognized with shock that it was George, the new acquisition her father had purchased at such extraordinary cost, now possibly dying from punishment that seemed designed more to terrorize witnesses than correct behavior. Something in that moment crystallized for Caroline, a recognition that she could not continue living in willful ignorance of the system her comfort depended upon, that witnessing this brutality created an obligation she could no longer avoid. The secret that could not remain hidden. 593 words. By December 1822, 3 months after George's arrival at Ashford Plantation, Caroline understood that her monthly courses had ceased, that her body was changing in ways she could not conceal indefinitely, and that she carried physical evidence of a transgression so profound it would destroy her family's reputation if discovered. The realization came gradually rather than suddenly, her body providing signs she initially attributed to stress or illness before their cumulative weight forced her to confront what they actually meant. She was pregnant, approximately 3 months along based on timing she could calculate with terrible precision, and the father was George. How it had happened, Caroline herself struggled to articulate even in the privacy of her own thoughts. It was not violent assault, which might have provided a narrative that society could comprehend and possibly forgive, given that white women were considered innocent victims of enslaved men's supposedly uncontrollable animal desires. Neither was it the kind of romantic love affair that novels portrayed, with mutual affection developing over time through intimate conversations and gradually intensifying attraction. What occurred between Caroline and George existed in territory that antebellum society had no language to describe, a connection forged through circumstances that combined proximity, isolation, moral awakening, and need that transcended the careful boundaries their world demanded they maintain. It had begun with Caroline visiting the quarters after George's whipping, bringing medical supplies that she had no expertise to administer, but felt compelled to provide. George had been confined to a cabin during his recovery, his back too damaged for immediate return to fieldwork, and Caroline had violated every protocol about white women entering enslaved workers' living spaces when she appeared with bandages and ointments stolen from the plantation's medical supplies. She told herself she was performing Christian charity, that helping an injured person was moral obligation regardless of their race or legal status. But something in how George looked at her during those visits, an expression that saw past the performance of benevolent mistress to the confused and morally conflicted woman beneath, had created a connection neither of them intended, but neither could deny once established. Their conversations during those visits had ranged across territory that would have scandalized anyone who overheard them. George spoke about his life before Ashford Hall, about being sold 3 times by age 22, about surviving through intelligence and physical endurance that white owners alternately exploited and feared. Caroline shared her own sense of captivity, of being property in different but parallel ways, her value determined by marriageability and reproductive potential, rather than any intrinsic human worth. They recognized in each other something that antebellum society insisted could not exist: genuine human connection that transcended the racial categories designed to make such connection impossible. What happened between them in late September, in the small cabin where George recovered from whipping, occurred with both inevitability and choice. Neither pure coercion nor simple consent, but something more complicated that acknowledged the profound power imbalances that made genuine consent impossible while also recognizing that human desire and connection could not be completely suppressed by social prohibition. Caroline had touched George's damaged back with hands that shook, feeling the raised welts and torn flesh, and George had turned to face her with an expression that asked questions she answered by not leaving when she should have, by staying when departure was still possible, by making choices that would irrevocably alter both their futures. Now, 3 months later, Caroline understood the consequences of that night with clarity that brought equal parts terror and a strange sense of purpose. She had perhaps 4 months before the pregnancy became impossible to hide beneath the structured gowns and corsets that defined respectable women's clothing, 4 months to decide whether to protect herself by condemning George or to protect George by destroying herself. 4 months before, revelation transformed private transgression into public catastrophe that would consume everyone involved. The colonel who discovered the unthinkable. 597 words. Colonel Ashford prided himself on maintaining control over every aspect of his plantation's operations, from cotton planting schedules to the personal lives of everyone who lived within his domain, enslaved and free alike. He monitored his daughters with the same obsessive attention he applied to crop yields, concerned always that their behavior reflect appropriately on the family's standing in South Carolina's planter aristocracy, that they comport themselves with the virtue and decorum that justified their elevated social position. His daughters represented the culmination of everything he had built, living proof that wealth and breeding could produce refinement that separated aristocracy from common people. He watched them carefully through the fall and early winter of 1822, noting changes in their demeanors that troubled him without initially suggesting anything beyond the usual emotional variations that women were believed to experience. Margaret had become withdrawn, spending more time alone in her room, declining social invitations that previously she would have accepted. Caroline had grown even more difficult about matrimonial prospects, rejecting a proposal from a perfectly suitable planter's son with arguments that struck Ashford as increasingly irrational. Elizabeth had abandoned even the minimal social engagement she typically maintained, retreating into books with intensity that suggested escape from something, rather than simple literary interest. Ashford attributed these changes to the disappointments and frustrations of unmarried women approaching ages when their value declined, to the natural melancholy that affected daughters who understood that time was narrowing their options. He responded with paternal concern that mixed genuine affection with practical worry about their futures, arranging additional social events, inviting potential suitors to visit Ashford Hall, applying gentle pressure for them to reconsider their resistance to matches he considered advantageous. But in early February 1823, when the family physician Dr. Raymond Hammond visited for routine health evaluations that wealthy families conducted quarterly, Ashford's understanding of his daughter's changed behavior underwent catastrophic revision. Dr. Hammond had been the Ashford family physician for 15 years, a discreet man who understood that wealthy families' private medical matters required confidentiality that protected reputations as carefully as it treated illnesses. He conducted his examinations in the privacy of each daughter's bedroom, spending perhaps 20 minutes with each woman, before emerging to provide Ashford brief summaries of their conditions. The summaries for Margaret and Elizabeth were unremarkable. Both women described as healthy, despite some fatigue, and minor digestive complaints that Hammond attributed to dietary issues common among women of their class. But when Hammond examined Caroline, his expression, as he emerged from her room, carried something that made Ashford's chest tighten with undefined dread. Hammond requested a private conversation in Ashford's study, closing the door behind them with deliberate care before delivering news that would shatter everything Ashford believed about his family and his control over the world he inhabited. "Colonel Ashford," Hammond began, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a physician accustomed to delivering difficult news. "I must inform you of something concerning Miss Caroline's condition. Based on physical examination, I believe she is pregnant, approximately 4 months along based on the signs I observed." The words struck Ashford with force that left him momentarily unable to respond, his mind refusing initially to process what Hammond was saying, because the implications were too catastrophic to immediately comprehend. Caroline was unmarried, had no acknowledged suitor, had been living under Ashford's supervision and protection in a household where such things were supposed to be impossible. Pregnancy required a father, required circumstances that should have been prevented by the very social structures that governed proper women's lives. "That is impossible," Ashford finally said, his voice strained. "Caroline has not been alone with any man, has not had opportunity for anything that would result in pregnancy. You must be mistaken in your diagnosis." But Hammond's expression confirmed that mistake was not possible, that whatever Ashford wanted to believe, medical evidence was unambiguous. Caroline was pregnant, and the pregnancy meant that somewhere, somehow, supervision had failed catastrophically. That control Ashford believed absolute was revealed as illusory. That his daughter had engaged in behavior that would destroy the family's reputation if discovered beyond the walls of Ashford Hall. The interrogation that revealed nothing. Futs 487 words. When Colonel Ashford confronted Caroline about her pregnancy on February 9, 1823, he did so with the cold fury of a man whose carefully constructed world had been revealed as a facade, concealing chaos he could not control. The interrogation occurred in his study, a room designed to intimidate with its dark wood paneling, heavy furniture imported from England, and portraits of Ashford ancestors whose expressions suggested perpetual judgment of descendants who failed to maintain family honor. Margaret and Elizabeth waited in an adjacent parlor, aware that something catastrophic was unfolding. but uncertain of specific details that would soon shatter their own carefully maintained secrets. Ashford stood behind his desk, using furniture as barrier between himself and his daughter, his posture rigid with barely contained rage. Caroline sat in a chair position to make her feel small and vulnerable, her hands folded in her lap, her expression carefully neutral. Despite the terror churning beneath the surface, she showed her father. The room smelled of cigars and old leather, masculine authority concentrated in a space where women entered only when summoned to account for failures or transgressions. "Dr. Hammond has informed me of your condition," Ashford began, his voice carrying the forced calm of a man struggling to maintain composure. "You will explain immediately how this occurred and identify the man responsible. I will not tolerate evasion or denial, Caroline. The evidence of your shame is irrefutable." Caroline met her father's eyes with steadiness that surprised them both. She had spent days preparing for this confrontation, calculating what she could say and what she must protect, understanding that truth would kill George while lies might accomplish nothing except delay inevitable catastrophe. "I will not identify him," she said quietly. No purpose would be served by revealing his identity. The response infuriated Ashford beyond what Caroline had anticipated. He slammed his hand on the desk with violence that made her flinch, his face reddening with rage that threatened to overflow the careful control he maintained in normal circumstances. "You will tell me his name, Caroline, or I will extract it through whatever means necessary. Do you understand what you have done? What disgrace you have brought upon this family? Your reputation is destroyed, your sister's prospects damaged by association, everything I have built threatened by your depravity." Caroline absorbed his fury without responding, maintaining silence that was itself an act of defiance in a world where daughters were expected to submit completely to paternal authority. She understood that naming George would lead immediately to his execution, that her father's rage would demand blood payment for the violation of racial and sexual boundaries that governed antebellum society. Silence was the only protection she could offer, inadequate but absolute, a refusal to participate in George's murder, regardless of what consequences she herself would face. The interrogation continued for over an hour, Ashford alternating between threats and promises, between rage and calculated attempts at manipulation. He threatened to send her away to an institution for fallen women, promised forgiveness if she would simply cooperate, suggested that the father might be someone socially acceptable who could be compelled to marry her and salvage some remnant of respectability. But Caroline maintained her silence with determination that Ashford finally recognized as unbreakable, at least through methods he could employ against his own daughter. The other daughters who hid. Similar secrets. 492 words. What Colonel Ashford did not yet know, what Caroline herself had not shared with her sisters despite suspecting the truth, was that she was not the only pregnant Ashford daughter. Margaret carried a child conceived in October 1822, approximately 1 month after Caroline's own conception, and Elizabeth was pregnant as well, her condition less advanced but unmistakable to anyone who examined her with medical competence. 3 daughters, all pregnant within months of each other, all refusing to identify the fathers, created a pattern that even the most willfully blind father could not ignore once the evidence assembled itself into unavoidable conclusion. Margaret had discovered her condition in late December, the same mounting dread that Caroline experienced, as her body provided signs that could not be attributed to illness or stress. She had considered confiding in Caroline, had noticed changes in her sister that suggested shared circumstances, but fear of judgment and uncertainty about how Caroline would respond had kept her silent. The isolation of their separate secrets created walls between women who might have found strength in solidarity, each convinced she alone carried the burden of transgression that would destroy everything if revealed. Elizabeth, youngest and least experienced in matters of physical intimacy, had been slowest to recognize what was happening to her body. She attributed missed courses to the disruptions that books suggested could occur from stress or dietary changes, attributed fatigue to the emotional strain of living in a household where tension had been mounting for months. But by early February, denial became impossible as physical changes progressed beyond what innocent explanations could account for. She was pregnant, approximately 2 months along, and the father was the same man who had fathered her sister's children, though none of the 3 women had yet confirmed to each other what each suspected about the others. The pattern their pregnancies created was not accidental. George had pursued each daughter with calculated intentionality, recognizing in them 3 potential weapons against the man who had purchased him as breeding stock, and planned to use him with the same casual cruelty Ashford applied to all enslaved people under his control. The relationships George formed with each woman combined genuine human connection with strategic calculation, attraction, mixing with revenge in ways that made motivations impossible to separate cleanly into categories of love or manipulation. Margaret had been first, her loneliness and intelligence making her vulnerable to attention from someone who saw her as person rather than marriageable property. Caroline had been second, her moral awakening after witnessing George's whipping, creating an opening for connection that violated every boundary their society maintained. Elizabeth had been last, her shyness and isolation making her desperate for recognition from someone who treated her with genuine interest rather than dismissive disregard. Each woman believed initially that her relationship with George was unique, that the connection they shared was singular and exclusive. None understood until much later that they were participants in revenge that used their bodies as weapons against their father, that George had transformed Ashford's breeding program into instrument of destruction aimed at the planter class that treated human beings as livestock to be managed and exploited without consideration for the humanity they contained. The investigation that pointed to one man, 498 words. Colonel Ashford, with the help of Samuel Crawford and 2 trusted overseers, began a methodical investigation in mid-February 1823 to identify which enslaved men might have had access to his daughters during the periods when conception must have occurred. The investigation was conducted with brutal efficiency that terrorized the entire enslaved population at Ashford Hall. Workers questioned under threat of whipping, movements tracked and documented, opportunities for unsupervised contact identified and cataloged, with the precision of men trained to maintain control through surveillance and intimidation. Crawford approached the investigation with the thoroughness that had made him successful at plantation management, creating timelines that documented where each daughter had been at various times, which enslaved men had been working in proximity to the main house or areas where daughters might venture, which workers possessed the literacy or social skills that might allow them to communicate with white women in ways that transcended the carefully policed boundaries between races and classes. The evidence accumulated slowly but inexorably toward a single conclusion that Crawford had suspected from the beginning, but which Ashford had resisted acknowledging, because the implications were too disturbing to accept easily. George was the only enslaved man who had been in proximity to all 3 daughters during the relevant time periods. His work assignments, which included maintenance tasks around the main house in addition to field labor, had given him access to areas where other enslaved men rarely ventured. His literacy and intelligence, the very attributes that made him valuable to Ashford's breeding program, also made him capable of communicating with educated white women in ways that illiterate field hands could not. More significantly, physical evidence suggested strongly that George was the father of all 3 pregnancies. The timing of conceptions correlated with his movements around the plantation, his presence near locations where daughters had been during periods when they were unaccompanied by appropriate chaperones. Crawford documented at least 7 occasions when George and Margaret had been in the same vicinity without adequate supervision, 5 occasions involving Caroline, and 3 involving Elizabeth, opportunities that combined into patterns suggesting systematic rather than random contact. But something in the investigation troubled Crawford, a detail that made the simple explanation of assault or coercion insufficient to explain what had happened. The daughters showed no signs of trauma, no fear of George when they inadvertently encountered him during plantation operations, no desire for his punishment that victims of violence typically exhibited toward their attackers. Their behavior suggested something more complicated than victimization, relationships that involved consent, however problematic that concept became when applied to circumstances where profound power imbalances made genuine consent theoretically impossible. Crawford reported his findings to Colonel Ashford on February 22, 1823, presenting documentation that pointed unambiguously to George as the father of all 3 pregnancies. The news confirmed what Ashford had begun to suspect but still found almost impossible to believe. His daughters, all 3 of them, had engaged in relations with an enslaved man, violating every racial and sexual taboo that defined antebellum Southern society, creating scandal that would destroy the family's reputation if it became known beyond Ashford Hall's boundaries. The betrayal Ashford felt was compounded by recognition that his breeding program, his careful plans to exploit George's genetics, had been transformed into a weapon used against him by the very property he thought he controlled completely. The confrontation that ended in blood, 495 words. On the night of February 23, 1823, Colonel Ashford made a decision that would prove fatal, though he approached it with the confidence of a man who had never personally experienced violence from enslaved workers and therefore could not imagine it occurring to him. He would confront George directly, extract a confession through whatever means necessary, and then administer punishment that would serve as warning to every enslaved person on the plantation about the consequences of violating racial boundaries that defined antebellum social order. Ashford brought Samuel Crawford and 2 armed overseers, men whose experience with violent discipline made them reliable enforcers of plantation justice, to the slave quarters at midnight when most workers would be sleeping. They found George alone in the cabin he occupied, awake as if he had been expecting confrontation, his expression carrying none of the fear that normally characterized enslaved people facing white men who arrived with weapons and accusations. Ashford ordered George outside, away from other cabins where enslaved workers might witness what was about to occur, toward the punishment area behind the barn where interrogations could be conducted with privacy that served both practical and psychological purposes. George complied initially, walking ahead of his captors with apparent docility that lulled them into believing he would submit to whatever they intended. But when they reached the barn and Crawford moved to secure George's wrists for whipping, George's demeanor changed with shocking suddenness. He had spent months calculating how he might resist when resistance became inevitable, had decided during those long nights in his cabin that death was preferable to the systematic humiliation and exploitation that defined his existence at Ashford Hall. What occurred next happened with violence so swift and overwhelming that the white men barely had time to register what was happening before it was too late to defend themselves. George grabbed Crawford first, his massive hands closing around the overseer's throat with force that crushed his windpipe before Crawford could scream for help. One of the overseers managed to raise his rifle, but George seized the weapon, turning it against its owner and firing at point-blank range that killed the man instantly. The second overseer fled, running toward the main house to raise alarm, but George caught him within yards and killed him with bare hands that possessed strength no ordinary man could match. Colonel Ashford, watching his authority collapse with terrifying speed, attempted to fire his pistol, but found his hands shaking too badly to aim effectively. George advanced on him with inexorable purpose, years of accumulated rage and humiliation, finding release in violence. That Ashford finally understood was revenge for every indignity, every exploitation, every moment of being treated as property rather than person. Ashford died slowly, George's hands around his throat but not squeezing hard enough to kill quickly, forcing the colonel to experience the terror and helplessness that enslaved people lived with constantly. By the time George released him, Ashford was dead, his body bearing evidence of struggle that would make clear to anyone who investigated that this was murder rather than accident, resistance rather than submission, the moment when property had refused to remain property regardless of consequences. The escape that left 3 bodies behind, 486 words. By dawn on February 24, 1823, Colonel Richard Ashford, Samuel Crawford, and 2 overseers lay dead in the area behind the barn, their bodies bearing injuries that suggested impossible violence, evidence of strength and rage that challenged every assumption slaveholders maintained about their ability to control the people they claimed as property. Ashford's windpipe had been crushed completely, Crawford's skull fractured with force that left fragments embedded in the wooden wall. The overseers killed with their own weapons turned against them before they could fire shots that might have raised alarm in time to prevent George's escape. George had vanished into the Carolina backcountry immediately after the killings, moving through darkness with speed that suggested careful planning rather than panicked flight. He carried nothing except a knife taken from Crawford's body and clothing stolen from the overseer's cabin, items that would allow him to survive in wilderness that killed unprepared travelers. He understood that pursuit would begin at first light, that slave patrols would organize within hours, that every resource available to South Carolina's planter class would be deployed to capture him and make his execution a public spectacle designed to terrorize any other enslaved people who might contemplate similar resistance. The discovery of the bodies created chaos at Ashford Hall that delayed pursuit by crucial hours. Margaret found her father's body first, having gone looking for him when he failed to appear for breakfast, and her screams brought the household running to witness carnage that would haunt everyone who saw it. The enslaved workers, gathered by remaining overseers who needed to account for everyone and identify who else might have fled, showed expressions that white observers could not quite read, something between horror and satisfaction, fear and hope. 3 pregnant daughters stood looking at their father's body, each woman processing complicated emotions that mixed grief with relief, horror at violence with recognition that George's escape meant he might survive, that their children's father might live free somewhere beyond the reach of the system that had tried to destroy them both. They said nothing to investigators about their relationships with George, maintaining silence that protected him, even as his absence made their pregnancy's paternity obvious to anyone who examined the timing of events. The magnitude of the killings created panic that spread across South Carolina's planter class within days. News traveled through networks that connected plantations across the region, rumors amplifying and distorting details until George became almost mythological figure, 7 feet tall and possessed of supernatural strength, capable of killing armed white men with bare hands and disappearing into wilderness without leaving trails that tracking dogs could follow. The story challenged fundamental assumptions that slaveholders maintained about their safety and control, suggesting that enslaved people could kill their owners and survive, that resistance was possible even against armed men, that the entire architecture of slavery might be more fragile than anyone had imagined. Bounties totaling over $2,000 were posted within a week, extraordinary sum that reflected both George's perceived danger and slaveholders' desperation to capture him before his example inspired other enslaved people to similar violence. The Manhunt that terrorized the South, 491 words. Within days of the killings at Ashford Hall, slave patrols organized across South Carolina and into neighboring Georgia, mobilizing resources that reflected planter-class terror about what George's escape represented for the entire system of slavery. Professional slave catchers arrived from as far as Virginia, drawn by bounties that totaled over $2,000 and by reputations that would be enhanced by capturing someone who had killed multiple white men and escaped. Tracking dogs were deployed, bloodhounds trained to follow scent trails through terrain that defeated human trackers, animals that could pursue fugitives for days without rest. But George proved extraordinarily difficult to track despite his size and the attention his escape generated. He moved through the Carolina backcountry with knowledge of terrain that suggested either careful planning or assistance from communities invisible to white society. He avoided roads and established paths, traveling instead through swamps and dense forests, where dogs lost his scent and trackers found no sign of his passage. His size, which should have made him conspicuous and easy to identify, ironically provided advantages in wilderness travel because his strength allowed him to traverse terrain that smaller men found impassable, to cover distances that exhausted pursuers attempting to match his pace. Sightings generated new pursuit efforts that inevitably ended with George vanishing again into landscape that seemed to protect him. A farmer near Columbia reported seeing an unusually tall black man traveling through his property at night. But by the time slave patrols arrived to investigate, George had moved on, leaving no trail that dogs could follow. A merchant in Augusta claimed George had purchased supplies using coin whose source could not be explained, but the description was ambiguous enough that authorities could not confirm whether the man was actually George or someone else of similar size. The manhunt consumed resources across the region for weeks, then months, becoming increasingly desperate as each failure made slave catchers look incompetent and made enslaved people across the South increasingly aware that escape was possible even after killing white men. Plantation owners increased security measures, imposing curfews and surveillance that made enslaved workers' lives even more restricted, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that poisoned relationships between owners and owned. Some planters advocated for more lenient treatment of enslaved people, arguing that George's violence was response to excessive brutality and that reducing cruelty might prevent similar incidents. But most rejected such suggestions as dangerous weakness that would encourage resistance by suggesting that violence produced meaningful change. The debate created divisions within planter class about how best to maintain control, whether through increased violence or through reforms that might reduce enslaved people's motivation for rebellion. As months passed without capture, some authorities began to suspect that George had died in the wilderness, succumbing to elements or injuries sustained during his flight. But periodic reports of sightings continued, suggesting either his survival or the existence of other fugitives, whose presence fed rumors that authorities found increasingly difficult to distinguish from reality. George had become larger than himself, transformed into legend that inspired hope among enslaved people and terror among slaveholders, regardless of whether the man himself still lived or had perished somewhere in the backcountry that swallowed him. The daughters who bore his children, 483 words, Margaret, Caroline, and Elizabeth Ashford gave birth between May and July 1823, their children arriving in a house still reeling from violence and scandal that had destroyed everything their family represented in South Carolina society. Margaret delivered first, a son born in early May who emerged with skin darker than any child born to white parents should possess, features that made paternity impossible to deny even if family members had been inclined toward willful blindness. Caroline's daughter arrived in late June, Elizabeth's son in mid-July, three infants whose mixed-race appearance announced to anyone who saw them the nature of transgressions that had preceded their father's violence and escape. The scandal destroyed the Ashford family's social standing with speed that would have seemed impossible before February. Invitations to social events ceased arriving. Families who had sought marriages with Ashford daughters now avoided any association with women whose children proved They had violated every racial and sexual taboo that defined respectable Southern womanhood. The plantation itself fell into disarray without Colonel Ashford's management, cotton yields declining as remaining overseers struggled to maintain control over enslaved workers who sensed that authority structures had collapsed. The family dispersed within months, unable to remain in proximity to memories and judgments that made normal life impossible. Margaret and her son moved to relatives in Virginia who agreed reluctantly to provide housing on the condition that she live in seclusion that prevented her presence from damaging their own reputation. She spent remaining years in a cottage on her uncle's property, raising her son in isolation that protected him from worst social consequences of his mixed-race heritage while denying him meaningful connection to either black or white communities. Carolyn and Elizabeth made different choices, refusing to separate and pooling resources to purchase a small property in the Carolina mountains, where they could raise their children away from society's judgment. They lived as spinsters who had adopted orphans, maintaining fiction thin enough that neighbors understood the truth, but thick enough to avoid direct confrontation about the circumstances that brought them to mountain isolation. Their children grew up neither fully white nor enslaved, occupying legal limbo because their mother's free status made them free by birth, but their appearance and parentage made them unmarriageable in white society and vulnerable to kidnapping by slave traders who might claim they were runaways. The children themselves bore the burden of circumstances they had not chosen and could not escape. They were living evidence of their father's revenge, their existence a permanent reminder of how profoundly George had violated the social order that tried to reduce him to property. Whether they ever learned the full truth about their conception, whether their mothers explained that they were products of relationships that combined genuine connection with calculated revenge, whether they understood themselves as consequences of love or weapons in a war their father waged against the system that enslaved him, the historical record provides no clear answer. The legend that grew in George's absence. 497 words. Over the following months and years, George became a legend whispered about in slave quarters across the South, a figure of resistance and revenge that inspired hope among enslaved people and terror among slaveholders regardless of whether the stories that circulated bore any relationship to actual events. The legend grew with each retelling, details embellished and modified to serve purposes that transcended factual accuracy, transforming George from individual man into symbol of what might be possible when enslaved people refused to remain enslaved, regardless of consequences. Stories circulated about sightings in multiple locations simultaneously, suggesting either George possessed supernatural ability to traverse impossible distances or multiple fugitives were being identified as George by witnesses predisposed to see him everywhere. A plantation owner in Georgia was found dead in his bed with crushed windpipe in circumstances that resembled Ashford's death, and slave patrols immediately attributed the killing to George despite no evidence connecting him to the location. 2 overseers in Alabama disappeared while pursuing a fugitive slave, their bodies later discovered in a swamp, with injuries that suggested violence from someone possessing extraordinary strength. Whether these incidents reflected George's actual movements or were unrelated events attributed to him by communities that needed to believe he survived and continued fighting, they served the function of suggesting that resistance was possible, that slavery's architecture of control had vulnerabilities that could be exploited by individuals willing to risk everything. The legend made George simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, a ghost haunting the South's collective imagination, proof that enslaved people could kill their masters and escape rather than submit to the systematic cruelty that defined their existence. Some stories portrayed George as righteous avenger, killing only plantation owners who participated in breeding programs or exhibited particular cruelty toward enslaved workers. Others described him as indiscriminate killer, motivated purely by rage rather than justice, murdering any white person unfortunate enough to encounter him. The variations revealed more about storytellers' purposes than about George himself, each version of the legend serving different needs within communities that created and perpetuated them. Among enslaved people, George's story functioned as coded message about resistance possibilities that could not be discussed openly without risking brutal punishment. Songs emerged in slave quarters that never mentioned George by name but told stories of giants who broke their chains and walked away from plantations that could not hold them, of men who loved white women and lived to tell about it, of violence that went unpunished because the perpetrator disappeared before justice could be administered. These songs spread across the South through networks invisible to white society, preserving memory of resistance that official records tried to erase. Among slaveholders, George's legend served as cautionary tale about the dangers of insufficient control and excessive cruelty, though which lesson they drew depended on their predispositions. Some argued George proved that enslaved people required constant surveillance and brutal discipline to prevent rebellion. Others contended that George's violence was response to Colonel Ashford's breeding program, and that more humane treatment would prevent similar incidents. The debate continued for years without resolution, both sides using George's example to support arguments they had already committed to before his escape. The truth that may never be known. 489 words. Whether George survived his flight into the Carolina backcountry or died somewhere in wilderness that swallowed fugitives with casual indifference, whether the subsequent killings attributed to him were actually his work or the work of others inspired by his example, whether his relationships with the Ashford daughters were coerced or consensual, these questions remain contested even among historians who have access to archives unavailable in 1823. The historical record provides fragments and silences, documents that reveal some truths while concealing others, evidence that supports multiple interpretations without confirming any single narrative definitively. What is documented beyond dispute is that slave patrols eventually stopped actively searching for George after 1829, suggesting either his death or successful escape to free states where Southern authorities had no jurisdiction. Bounty notices that initially appeared in newspapers across the South gradually disappeared, replaced by other fugitive advertisements that reflected more immediate concerns. George's name vanished from official records with the same deliberate erasure that characterized how antebellum society managed scandals, too disturbing to acknowledge publicly. What remains undocumented but whispered about in family histories that descendants have preserved across generations are the dozens of children born across South Carolina between 1823 and 1829, whose extraordinary size and ambiguous racial features suggested George's continued presence in the region long after official pursuit ended. Some families have oral traditions claiming descent from George, passed down through generations with pride that contemporary descendants feel but that their ancestors could never express publicly. DNA evidence that might confirm or refute these claims remains largely uncollected, partly from lack of interest among academic historians, and partly from reluctance among descendants to subject family legends to scientific scrutiny that might disprove beliefs that have sustained them. The question of whether George's relationships with the Ashford daughters constituted assault or something more complicated remains particularly contentious among historians who have examined available evidence. Modern frameworks of consent recognize that genuine consent cannot exist in circumstances where such profound power imbalances make refusal dangerous or impossible, suggesting that regardless of what the Ashford daughters believed they were choosing, George's enslaved status meant that relationships could not be truly consensual. Yet the daughters' documented behavior, their refusal to identify George as their children's father, even when doing so might have provided them some social protection, their apparent lack of trauma or desire for his punishment, suggests relationships that involved agency, however problematic that agency became when examined through frameworks of structural power. Perhaps the most significant truth about George's story is how thoroughly antebellum society tried to erase it. Church records, plantation ledgers, and courthouse documents from the period show careful gaps where George's name should appear. Evidence of deliberate destruction or suppression by families and institutions desperate to bury scandals that challenged foundational myths about racial control and social order. The erasure itself testifies to how profoundly George's resistance threatened the entire system of slavery, how completely his story contradicted the narratives slaveholders told themselves about docile property and benevolent masters, how dangerous memory of his escape remained even decades after events occurred. The ending. Written in blood and silence. 498 words. The story of George the Giant ends not with capture or confirmed death, but with silence. The kind of silence that antebellum society imposed on events too disturbing to acknowledge publicly, too threatening to the social order to allow them to remain visible in historical memory. Church records, plantation ledgers, and courthouse documents from the period show careful gaps where George's name should appear, evidence of deliberate erasure by families and institutions, desperate to bury scandals that challenged foundational myths about racial control and white supremacy that justified the entire system of slavery. The Ashford daughters lived out their lives in relative obscurity, their stories preserved only in fragments that descendants chose to share generations later, when speaking publicly about such matters no longer threatened family reputation. Margaret died in 1852 at her Virginia cottage, her son having disappeared years earlier, possibly passing as white in some distant city where no one knew his parentage. Caroline and Elizabeth lived together in the Carolina Mountains until Caroline's death in 1858. Elizabeth surviving until 1876, long enough to see slavery end but not long enough to witness whether freedom would meaningfully improve circumstances for people of African descent. Their children grew up bearing the burden of parentage that society could neither accept nor completely erase. Some disappeared into free black communities in northern cities, their mixed heritage allowing them to occupy spaces between racial categories that antebellum America had tried to make rigid and impermeable. Others remained in the South, passing as white when possible or living as free people of color in communities that developed their own social structures parallel to white society. A few were kidnapped and enslaved despite their legal freedom, their appearance and ambiguous parentage making them vulnerable to slave traders who operated with impunity in regions where legal protections for free black people existed primarily in theory rather than practice. As for George himself, whether he found freedom in the North, died fighting in the Carolina wilderness, or lived hidden among communities of escaped slaves that existed in the margins of Southern society, the historical record provides no definitive answer. Some historians believe he reached Canada via the Underground Railroad, that sympathetic abolitionists helped him travel through free states to permanent safety beyond American borders. Others contend he died within months of his escape, that wilderness or slave patrols caught him before he could reach free territory, that authorities suppressed documentation of his capture to avoid creating a martyr whose public execution might inspire additional resistance. What remains is the story itself, a narrative of revenge and resistance that refuses to stay buried despite 2 centuries of official silence, suggesting that some truths are too powerful to erase completely, no matter how thoroughly society attempts to forget them. George transformed the breeding program designed to exploit his genetics into weapon against the planter class that treated human beings as livestock, used his body and those of the Ashford daughters to create scandal that destroyed one of South Carolina's most prominent families, and escaped into legend that inspired hope among enslaved people and terror among slaveholders for generations after his disappearance. The silence that followed his escape testifies more eloquently than any preserved records to how profoundly his resistance threatened the entire system of slavery.